Our first panelist alphabetically is Samantha Deffler, who is Associate Professor of Psychology at York College of Pennsylvania. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Neuroscience from Bucknell University and received her MA and PhD from Duke in Cognition and Cognitive Neuroscience. Welcome, Dr. Deffler. Our next panelist is Dalmacio Dennis Flores, who is Assistant Professor of Nursing at the University of Pennsylvania. He received his BSN from Kennesaw State University, his MSN from Emory University, and his PhD from Duke. Welcome, Dr. Flores. Our next panelist is Mashal Saif, who is Associate Professor of Religion at Clemson University. She holds a BA in Religious Studies, Asian Studies, and International Studies from Macalester College, and her MA and PhD from Duke's Graduate Program in Religion with a focus on Islamic Studies. Welcome, Dr. Saif. And our final panelist is Dr. Nikki Taylor, who is Professor of History at Howard University. She holds a bachelor's degree in history from University of Pennsylvania and an MA and PhD in U.S. history from Duke. We are delighted to feature all these successful alumni on today's panel. So we have shared with the panelists a list of questions, including the questions that many of you submitted through the registration. So what we'll do is we'll start with a list of questions that I've shared with them ahead of time. We'll invite each panelist to answer these questions for about 1 to 2 minutes. And we'll also have an opportunity, if you want to pose a follow-up question in the chat, you're welcome to post that. And at the end of the session, then we'll turn to the chat for any questions that may have popped up, as well as give you an opportunity to join live on audio and video if you want to share a question with our panel. So audience members, we'll look forward to having your questions and engagement as we go along. All right, so to get started, I'm going to start in alphabetical order with Samantha and ask you to share the balance of faculty responsibilities in research, teaching, and service at your institution. And tell us, what do you look for in new faculty members, generally speaking, to be a good fit?
Thank you. So hi, everyone. York College of Pennsylvania is a primarily undergraduate serving institution, and that is reflected in the balance of responsibilities that faculty have at York. So depending upon the time in the semester and how anxious my students are at that point in time, I spend between 50 to 60% of my time on teaching and academic advising. So at York, professors are advisors within the major. And then that remaining 40%, I try my hardest to split between service and research, but I have moved through the promotion process and become an associate professor, I found that I'm spending a little bit more time on service. I'm the chair of our institutional review board, so that takes up a lot of my time. I really like that balance. I sought that balance. And when we are looking for new faculty, we are looking primarily for people who want to teach well, and want to teach and advise undergraduates. And so, as we'll talk a little bit more throughout the panel, I've served very recently on 2 search committees as we're trying to find someone new. And we are always first and foremost focusing in application materials for whether people want to teach. That's really what we do. So.
Terrific, Samantha. Dennis.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Hello from Philadelphia. So I think ideally in our university here at Penn, they'd love for us to have focus on the research and also have responsibilities for teaching, leadership, and service. I can say that because of the pandemic, things kind of shifted and we had to respond based on that. So certainly, when the pandemic started, and then throughout the next 2 years, so 3 years total, there has been explicit direction from university leadership that we were focused on the teaching mission. Not to say that we were ignoring our research, but certainly there was some moving about of effort. And obviously, service to the profession and leadership in that regard is also something that is an expectation. I'm in the School of Nursing, by the way, so I need to preface my responses based on that disciplinary orientation. I can say that having been on a search committee for the last 3 years, I actually just rotated off. What we do, or how we do it in our department, is that all of the hires come in through the search committee, and not I mean, there are special committees for higher up positions that require a newly constituted, group of folks. But essentially, there's a core group in the search committee where everybody goes through, and we vet them. And then, depending on how people qualify, they either, go forward or not. And I would say, to the question of generally speaking, to be a good fit, in our school, the calls for applications are very specific. Like, we are looking for this kind of skill set, this kind of research priority for this kind of person. So people really need to fit and have evidence of, they have the background, the training, and the productivity for that. Everybody else who applies for it, they may try. Some folks can actually make an argument for it, but we're essentially looking for a very particular position most of the time.
Thank you. Marshall.
Hi, everyone. So I'm at Clemson University, which is pretty recently an R1 institute, and I'll say they care deeply about maintaining and forwarding that R1 status. So in the time that I've been here, which is almost a decade, conversations have revolved overwhelmingly around research, in terms of just there's a big push at my institution to focus on research. In our job contracts, the breakdown is 50% research, 35% teaching, and 15% service. Our teaching load in my department is 2-2. So, one can decide, and we have small classes, and we are an undergraduate only department. So there is also, while I'll say the university, overwhelmingly focuses on just talking about the significance of research. It's not as if they never talk about students and teaching, but the emphasis is, on elevating Clemson's research status at the moment. But within our department specifically, I'll say, because it's undergraduate focus, we have small classes. Most of my colleagues, if not all my colleagues, I see as deeply invested teachers also. So when we hire, on the one hand, we're looking for an excellent research profile, but also someone who's going to be deeply interested in undergraduate teaching and is going to be a good mentor to students. We also advise our own students, like I think Samantha mentioned. And then there's service, and everyone just has to do it. And you can decide, there's departmental service, whether that's service on search committees or any other departmental committee, but there's service at the college and university level, and then obviously to the profession. And one can make, some degree of decision about how much service one wants to do.
And for me, currently, I'm at an institution that is a 60-30-10, with 10 being service and the 60 being research. But I've been all over the place in my career. Those degrees can take you anywhere you want to go. So I've been at elite liberal arts colleges, R2, R1 institutions, elite state schools, the whole nine. If you're applying, you have to be very clear that you understand the institution, even before you do the application and the letter of interest, because each institution has a different weight on those things. When I was at Vassar, it was teaching. And so at Howard, it's not so much. You really have to get your research out there. And then there are different points in your career where you may personally switch the percentages. So for 11 years, I was an administrator. And so it was 90% service and 5% teaching and 5% research. And so it really is something that you have to adjust within yourself throughout your career. I published books when I was a dean and also as a chair. So I'd never give up the 60-30 split in my mind, but you do have to play into whatever institution you're going to be hired at.
Excellent advice. Thank you, everyone. So our next question is, during the initial application screening, what materials do you read first? When do you consider the teaching statement, the research statement, the diversity statement, letters of recommendation, those kinds of materials? So I think let's just go backwards from the way that we started. We'll start with Nikki this time.
Okay. Well, I personally, and I've been on, interviewing and reviewing graduate applications most of my career. I always start with the letter of interest because that is where I get to really understand who the candidate is. I get to understand their intellectual path that got them to the point that they want to apply for your institution. So the letter of interest, research statement is another thing, because it really, like, if you put a job ad out there and you're looking for a 19th century scholar or historian, and then the letter you're getting is saying, oh, I'm doing 20th century, then that can immediately, put the halt on the process. The next thing I go to are the letters of recommendation, because again, becoming a colleague, or even when you're applying to graduate PhD programs, is very intimate and very personal. And you want to make sure that the person has the same core values of the institution, that they believe in the mission of the institution, that they understand how to work collaboratively. And so those letters of recommendation are very, very huge. And I don't care as much about the diversity statement, ironically, as the only Black woman on the panel, but it comes out, people's life experiences in their cover letter. It comes out in the letters from their faculty advisors. And so that's not as important, because it's hard to really write a letter about how you will bring it's just hard. So that doesn't mean as much to me personally.
I'll jump in. I'll mention over here that it surprised me as when I was on the job market. I think I learned on the fly for the first time that, how varied search committees can be. Let me explain what I mean by that. So I'm in a department of philosophy and religion, and I do Islamic studies. And it is very common in our department for us to be really explicit. I don't know if other departments are as explicit about this, but I think ultimately none of us can know enough about even our own field, let alone another discipline. Again, I'm in philosophy and religion. This is a common sort of configuration. So when we do searches, I will, so there's a search committee I'm on right now, and I've been on search committees previously. We will very explicitly ask, our colleagues in philosophy right now, I'm on a philosophy search committee, that help me orient myself as I look at these applications. And I think just sort of keeping that in mind, that even if we just look at religion, when I was on the job market, I realized as I was interviewing at places, I was going to be the only Islamic studies person. So the people who are doing Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, they didn't know enough about my field, and that's perfectly understandable. So I'd also say cater your materials to that. So when we also, as I read, I frequently, feel not fully in the know as I'm reading things. I think that's common whether or not people are admitting it. So I will ask others to help orient me, especially if it's a philosophy hire that we are doing. I'll usually look at their statement of interest first, followed by their CV. Although I would say recently there was an article I was reading that said, don't do that. But I think it is, even in that article, they mentioned it is common practice to look at places that folks have graduated from, thinking about, did you go to elite institutions or not? And I'd say, since you're all Duke folks, I think you have an in there. But I think that is common practice from everything that I've read, although there are critiques of that. And I look at letters of recommendation. When it comes to, Wisconsin doesn't require diversity statements. We look at other documents, whether those are, a statement of research interest or whether that's a whole writing sample. But again, I'll say, I'm not sure to what degree folks are reading all that material super closely when you have hundreds of applications. For me, the three things that stand out, starting with the letter of interest, the CV, and then the letters of recommendations. Those are the things I'm going to be reading most closely. Obviously, the research statement counts for a lot, but you're already getting a sense of that from the CV, from the letters of recommendation, which then help inform even the letter of interest. You know, you're discussing that. So those are the three things that I read first and the closest. I'll stop there.
So again, I want to emphasize that in the 3 years that I've been on a standing search committee, we do have these job descriptions that are crafted based on our department needs. And so if your packet clearly shows that you can respond to our identified need, you rise up. You become competitive. And I found myself, I actually devote like 2 hours prior to the search committee meeting to look at new materials that have come in since the last month. And it's quite interesting. By the second and third year, I had a process where I remind myself, for this particular position, this is what we're looking for. I open up that letter of intent. Because that's your only chance, as far as I'm concerned, to articulate in your own way, in your own language, how you're a good fit. And so if you cannot make that case in the first paragraph or somewhere in the first portion of the letter, my attention kind of drifts. And so this is really, it's like lip syncing for your life. We need to know, you are the expert of your science. And so for you to be able to convey that to a stranger is of primal importance. And then I go to the CV, because I hone in on what is the match between what you state is your expertise and your productivity. And so if you've got initial publications that are a direct link, then it's perfect. I'm happier, and I actually take notes. I usually have like 3 to 5 bullet points for each candidate. And if I can't come up with the third, fourth, and fifth, that's a little unexciting, and I kind of move on to the next person's packet. So that's just how it is. As was stated, there could be hundreds of applicants. Well, I've not experienced hundreds of applicants, maybe 10 for every month of a meeting. But this is nursing, and very, very niche in some ways. But that's the process that I go by. And then when I get excited, I tend not to look at the letters of recommendation, because to me, for time element, honestly, but also these are your cheerleaders, and I kind of expect that, they're part of the team already. So I can be that cheerleader for you as long as the CV and the letter of intent are in sync and are a good fit. Make the case.
So I have been on 2 searches recently, and our situation might be a little different than the other institutions. It's just our department searching, and there's 5 of us. So, but thankfully we have not had hundreds of applicants. I don't even know what I would do with that. But we have a rating system that we use so that we can kind of rank candidates based on rating. Keep in mind, we're psychologists. We like data and Likert scales and all that kind of fun stuff. But I also start with the CV, not necessarily looking at school, but more just making sure that the person has applied for a job that they fit for, and then I can eliminate people from there if it just doesn't make sense that they've applied. And for you all coming, being well trained and everything, I don't think that's going to be the case for you. But sometimes we get some interesting applications where I'm like, you're not even in academia, but you work down the road from the college, and so you're applying. So I pull those out. I then look at the cover letter, where I am looking to make sure that the candidate has actually researched where I am employed, knows what our mission is, has thought about how they would fit into that mission, and I consider whether they have read our job announcement carefully, or if they're treating applications a little bit like Pokemon, where they got to catch them all. Like, they want to say they applied for 40 jobs and they wanted to add us so that they got to number 40. I would much rather see a very, a nice analysis of where the candidate would fit in with our department and with our very focused mission on teaching and mentoring undergraduates. I then look at the teaching statement to make sure that what they're claiming in the cover letter matches what they've considered in the teaching statement, and then when it has been a tenure track assistant professor position, because right now we're searching for an instructor, but when it's been a position that requires research, I have read the research statement to see if they have considered how that particular research agenda would fit in at my institution, and have looked to see whether they've considered how that might morph at a place like York and how they might include undergraduates in that agenda. So again, making sure that the packet is indicating to the search committee that this person actually wants to teach at my institution and do what I do, because everyone finds their own rewarding professional career in wherever they end up, one would hope. And all the people in my department came from places like Duke and chose to be at York doing what we do. And we want a colleague who has made that very thoughtful decision to apply to us, as opposed to, I want a job, I need a job, here's a job opening, let me send my application in.
Thank you all. Wonderful advice. I want to ask a follow-up question, and I'll throw this one open to anybody who wants to comment. So all of you talked in different ways about looking at the candidates' materials to see a fit and alignment between the need of your department and institution and what the candidate can offer. And so there was a question from someone in our audience, what is the value then of having a personal website that can't be tailored to particular institutions? Is that seen as a drawback? Do folks even look at the personal website when they're reviewing materials?
So I'll chime in first. I look if it's listed in the application, and the couple that come to mind were useful because it was obvious that this person was tailoring their applications to institutions like mine. So they were not applying to both the small regional undergraduate and the R1. They were very obviously searching for a job like we were offering. And so that was helpful to demonstrate that. It's not, I haven't had the experience where I've said, oh, this person wrote this narrative to us, but it's been different on their website.
I've also found myself looking at the website if they do offer a personal website, but I actually tend to go to social media and do a quick search. Academia is tiny, I think, regardless of your discipline. And if they're kind of friends with people in your discipline, then you kind of know they have a footprint somewhere. So I'm looking at professional social media. And that's always a good indication. Or, if they're tweeting about relevant issues about the field. So that's also kind of indicative to me that, okay, this is a person who is engaged, not just in a lot of ways. So that's always a plus. But it's not quite a requirement for us to have personal websites.
All right, terrific. Marshall, yes.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, it's, if the candidate provides it, I've looked at it, but I don't think it's ever come up in committee discussions. I don't think it's necessary. I've never heard, at least in our department, we've never discussed a person's Twitter or X at this point. Yeah, it's interesting to hear though how other people are handling.
Terrific. Thank you, everyone. So next, we're going to move on to a question about actually looking and digging in on experiences that folks list on their CVs in terms of teaching experience, publication record. At your institutions, in your departments, how are those elements weighted in determining which candidates will move forward into the interview pool? And let's just start with Samantha and move alphabetically again this time.
So I'm going to comment specific to tenure track PhD level positions, because I think that's what most of the people here would be targeting. We are most interested in your teaching experience. We're going to be investing, mentorship time and resources in hiring. And so we want to make sure that you can teach and that you like teaching. I teach a 4-4 load. So I'm doing a lot of teaching. For publication record, again, for tenure track lines at my institution, you do need to publish to get tenure, but in some way, like it's a little laughable. It's like 1 to 2 publications in like 4 to 5 years. It's very minimal. Our department is more productive than that. I have been more productive than that, but that's not necessary. And so when looking at publication record, we are interested in, are you published? Can you follow a project from start to finish? Will you be capable of doing that while balancing this heavy teaching load? And also we are looking at the type of research you're doing and starting to think whether you would be successful at our institution where, you know, we don't have an fMRI scanner, right, as an example. And so we want to see, and Melissa, I'm looking at the list of questions. Do you want me to just cover the little one that's addressed to me anyway?
Sure, that's
So
great.
There's a question about like how to market yourself coming from an R1. I think you market yourself to a college like mine by really saying that you are enthusiastic about teaching and providing evidence that you have already done that. So like the biggest shout out in the world to the certificate in college teaching at Duke and for preparing future faculty. Like that got me, and I had a visiting position before I was at York, but that got me this job. And that got me tenure. That was wonderful. I never felt like I wasn't prepared. And so we want to make sure that you're prepared. And if your research is theoretical and specific, that's okay. You just need to be able to articulate how that would translate into my institution. So would you be able to continue to do that? And if you say yes, we would want to know what kind of resources you would need. And we would think about whether we can provide that to you. I will say that a big red flag as we've had searches where we've actually decided not to give offers to top candidates is when those candidates insist, yeah, you want me to teach, but really I'm very enthusiastic about my research and I'll be able to continue my research productivity at the level that I've been doing this in graduate school. That's a red flag to us, the insistence that you would continue with that level of productivity when we know that that would detract from your ability to teach. Oh, nice shout out, Melissa, for the certificate in college teaching. Go do that. If you want to teach at a place like mine, if you're thinking liberal arts or small regional college, go get the certificate in college teaching. We give extra points in our rating system to people who have graduate level training in college teaching.
So I'll also echo that and say that as an alum of the Certificate in Teaching program and PFF, I wear it as a badge of honor. Actually, I only applied to 3 places as I was wrapping up my postdoc here at Penn, at Yale, and at Emory. And I know that it was a very strong teaching background that I had, which excited people in those other places. And I find myself now, when I'm looking at materials, do they have anything explicit about that? If I see somebody also say that they're working on their teaching certificate, because, you know, we're going to be educators. That's the point. I'm already partial to that person. So that's like the biggest thing for me. And then again, also depending on the track, there's a teaching track for us here, and then there's the research track. The publications are obviously a lot more to consider if we're hiring for the tenure track, to see that there's a given number of pubs per year in their postdoc or even during their doctoral program. That's always you know, a good signifier of how they would continue on once they become part of the faculty.
Did we lose Marshall? All right, Nikki, can I ask you to step in and hopefully she'll be able to rejoin?
Okay, no problem. We don't look at teaching at all in my institution. Although we understand it's important, the thing about teaching that we look at in candidates for assistant professor positions or even long-term contingent faculty positions are a great syllabus and a great course idea. So if you have an absolutely cutting edge, sexy topic that you would like to offer that you know we aren't teaching, then that is more attractive. And if you happen to have a syllabus, but we understand people are writing dissertations, and that, you know, is not for us. For most, you know, research 2 and research 1 institutions, it's really an emphasis on your research. Have you published since you've been in graduate school? And also the length of time to degree tells us a lot about how long it will take you to publish. So my background is in history. So if it's taken you 9 years to get your PhD in history, then that's beyond the tenure clock for us, which is 7 years. So we know you're not going to be productive to get tenure. So that's the thing that I would like to contribute to this conversation.
Thank you, Nikki. Can I ask a follow-up question? You know, if somebody has taken 9 years, I would imagine that could have happened, say, to a history PhD student during the pandemic, if their access to archives they needed to, you know, complete their dissertation research was cut off, or something like that. You know, is there a place that you would look for someone to explain that long time to degree? And is there anything they could say to persuade you to still consider that?
Yeah, definitely now because of the pandemic, but we're like a year away from the pandemic at this point. And so, and it's a problem. When I was at Duke, the average time for a PhD in history was 9.5 years. And that was crazy. And, you know, a lot of my peers didn't necessarily have the easiest time getting positions for that singular, brilliant dissertations, but it just is a little bit more difficult when you know, have not produced the dissertation in that 7-year time frame. And so I used to think, oh, nobody should really care about that. But I see now on the other side as a full professor that it really does speak to a level of which, you know, maybe you're not as focused, or maybe you have personal issues or health challenges. We are empathetic about that. But it still says something about whether or not you'll even become what we call a permanent associate professor as well, which none of us like. We like you to get tenure and then within 7 to 10 years become a full professor after that.
Thank you. I want to turn to our next question now, and I think we'll start with Nikki this time. How do search committees view transdisciplinary or multidisciplinary candidates? And how can applicants present cross-disciplinary work as a strength, especially in departments that are more discipline focused? I know we may have some folks in the audience who maybe did a postdoc in a different discipline than their PhD, for example. So how do you handle that from a search committee perspective?
Oh, wow. This is a very thorny issue, Melissa, because we have epic battles in our department about this very thing. So back when I got my PhD in history, most people were getting their PhDs in history who then went on to work in history departments. But now it looks like to me American Studies is a far more popular degree. People have it from places like Yale or even African American Studies from Harvard. And my department, and we're we're ranked 3rd in African American history. If you don't have a PhD in history, don't even apply. I'm not personally like that. It was hard when I was chair because I understand interdisciplinarity and I use it in my own research, but there are hardline, strict disciplinarians that think if you have American Studies, go work in American Studies department. I think as you know, we get further along in the march of time, people will have to be more flexible. But I think we're outliers in that case, in that if you don't have a PhD in history, you can't really get a job in our department.
I think for us, it's actually quite an asset if a PhD prepared nurse does a postdoc elsewhere in a different discipline. has a record of productivity with other folks, like they can show that they can work well with other people, and then they're coming back now for a faculty position in a school of nursing, because you're able to show that you really did use the postdoc as an opportunity to enhance your skill set on a particular thing that is very useful back for us. And so that's exciting. We've had wonderful applicants that way. And then we've had folks completely trained from in other disciplines applying to the School of Nursing, and we're open to that. To me, as long as you're able, again, to articulate why your skill sets from sociology, for example, or public health is of benefit to nursing, that's wonderful. And if you're able to show some initial productivity, again, with other nursing scientists or in a field such as gerontology, which is pretty broad, or workforce issues, then it green lights to me. I don't need to be such a guardian of the discipline that way. And additionally, if you're trying to apply in another discipline, I think it really behooves you to make sure to show to folks that you understand that discipline, not just at a very superficial level, but that your work that you've trained so hard at Duke, this is how you're infusing it in the other department, and show examples of that. Make them excited about why you're breaking these barriers. And so I'm all about other folks joining and then getting training elsewhere and then coming back.
For us, I would say that we're not necessarily concerned with where what your PhD is in, or what you did your postdoc in, but rather we are often hiring to teach particular classes. And so the example I give is there's only one cognitive psychologist on staff. It's me, right? And if I left, they would try to find another cognitive psychologist. And so if that's what the call is for, and you fit that bill, and you can teach cognitive psychology and the other classes that we would have to teach, like Psych 100, right? If you're going to try to teach Psych 100, you should probably know psychology, broadly speaking. If you can make the case in your cover letter, it does not necessarily matter to us what your specific PhD was in. However, that might be different for other departments, even within the social sciences and humanities, if there are accreditation issues. So I'm thinking in particular our education program. They have very set accreditation standards, and so they would care more on a search about what your degree was in.
It's wonderful to hear such diverse reactions to this question. And so I hope that gives our audience some sense of how you might approach interdisciplinarity in your application. So next, we'll just start with Samantha again. What's the kind of profile of the new assistant professor hire? Is it someone straight out of a PhD, straight out of a postdoc? Have they done a visiting assistant professorship or some kind of a time-limited teaching experience, right? Who are you hiring as assistant professors at your institution?
So the last assistant professor that they hired was me, and I had a visiting assistant professorship for 1 year after I graduated from Duke. Prior to that, the other assistant professors they had hired, if they had their PhD and they had visiting positions or other positions in teaching, as opposed to a more research-focused postdoc. Last year, we had a search to fill a tenure line. It ended up being a failed search. In my opinion, our job ad was written weirdly. It was a weird pool. And I've also heard that last year was a weird year for job applications. In that search, again, remember it was a failed search, but our two people that we brought to campus were ABD. So they did not have their PhDs, but they were about to defend. And they both had extensive teaching experience. They had been adjuncts, they had done summers, they had done teaching assistantships where they were maybe not instructor of record, but they were teaching lab sections or lecture sections.
In nursing, a postdoc is required now. And even if you were coming from another discipline and applying to nursing, a postdoc is almost essentially a requirement. A teaching record, as I said, is great. I will fight for you if I see a teaching record in there. Additionally, I think folks might want to explore other training opportunities. If there are centers across the country that are funded with a T32 or an R25, you might want to look that up, because those are federally funded centers for further postdoc training. It's unfortunate, but like in a place in an R1 institute, you need, if you're able to show the numbers T32 or F31 or an R eventually, those numbers talk. It just, in the way that your Duke PhD will open opportunities, some of these other signifiers as well, in terms of further training. So it's a requirement.
Nikki, do you want to go next? And then we'll turn to Marshall, who's been able to rejoin us.
Well, no, I'll let Marshall step in here.
So Marshall, our question is, who is kind of the profile of a new assistant professor in your department? Are they coming straight out of a PhD program? Have they done a postdoc? Have they done some kind of time-limited teaching experience like a VAP? Who are you hiring?
It's been across the board, and sorry everyone for ducking out. There was an internet outage on campus, which never happens, but we've hired folks fresh from PhD programs who've had no teaching experience, maybe just seeing, but just good recommendations about their teaching, and in the classroom and thought, okay, this person seems like they could teach really well. And we've hired folks who've done postdocs, who've been at VAPs in addition to a postdoc, or folks who are already at assistant physicians who just want to move for whatever reason. There's no one, it's been across the board. I feel like we've done all combinations.
And for me, it's the same as Masho's response. It's been across the board. While we prefer someone who's fresh out of a PhD program, because we can shape them in the image of the institution, which is what we want. We can indoctrinate them with the mission of Howard University if they're young and fresh. It's a little harder when you're my age as an assistant professor, but we're open. We've had people who had other assistant professor positions and it didn't work out for tenure. We've had people who were on the market for years and did postdocing, and then they ended up being a contingent faculty at their alma mater. So I think the goal on our end is to be flexible. Getting to your other question, Melissa, being flexible with how we understand people's life experiences may not be linear. Like I was fresh out of undergraduate when I started at Duke, finished very quickly from Duke, but people like me are rare now. I think most applicants have other life experiences in between the BA and the PhD program. And so we also understand that people have different life experiences between the PhD and their first or even second assistant professor position. And so we get it. And so I think people shouldn't be too afraid of the process, but we definitely want people like you on this call, fresh out of a PhD program.
That is wonderful news. So the next question, we've heard some folks share some kind of red flags that they notice when they're reviewing application materials. Is there anything any of the panelists want to bring up that we haven't talked about in terms of anything you see in application materials that would kind of be immediately disqualifying?
I can go first. What's immediately disqualifying for a small department like mine is an overzealous applicant who keeps emailing us repeatedly And I get the excitement and the interest and where am I in the process? What's the status update? But, you know, talk with your advisor about the timeline and the calendar of a search. So you're applying now, but you might not be offered a campus visit until February or March. And some places are even later than that. And so you just have to be patient, trust the universe will take you exactly where you were supposed to go. And just don't sweat it. It's very stressful. I get that. But when you start sweating it, it comes across in the emails, and it's just, we've eliminated people just based on the basis of that. Like they're harassing us. And it's not real harassment, but it feels that way to us. And so I think that is another thing. Another red flag is when we get cover letters that do not seem to understand what kind of institution we are. And so the mission of Howard University is very unique in academia. And so if somebody is writing and this letter looks like it could be written for a Georgetown application, oh, do they know who we are? It's not, the point is not just to be in Washington, D.C., which is a lovely city, but you really have to understand the institution. Or being at if I were at a liberal arts college, you know, and the person is writing as if this is a R1 institution. And so I think that is it takes extra time. It means you cannot do a stamped one letter fits all application. You have to have different letters for teaching liberal arts schools like Vassar and York College, different letter for places like Howard and North Carolina Chapel Hill, and a different letter for Penn and Harvard and Duke. And so you can't have the same letter every place.
Nikki, I couldn't agree more. I'll just add a couple of additional things to what you've said, which is I don't recall any of our, the candidates to whom we made offers ever sending email. So not only is that a red flag, like it's just not the norm. I think for the most part, you can send a thank you email after your visit. You can send a thank you email after the first round of interviews, but the search committee will contact you. I'd say let them do their thing. There's no reason unless, if you, for example, have a publication that has come out, that I think you can email them and say, hey, in the past 2 months, since we last talked, this publication's come out. But other than that, I say let them do their thing. And tailoring, you're absolutely spot on about that. Yeah, and just I think the biggest red flag for us is when you apply for a job that you're not even qualified for, right? So that's what leads to and we sort of discussed that initially. I think someone else brought that up. But I'll say for many, at least in my experience at my institution, again, we're focused on undergraduate teaching in my department, and we don't have a ton of faculty in our relatively small department. We're expecting, there's a call for my position, it was Islamic studies. You could do anything in Islamic studies. For the philosophy positions that we're advertising, they're really broad. So that leads to large pools of applicants. But, as long as you have a good research profile at my institution, that's what counts. And you show your interest. The department cares about undergraduate teaching. So if you show your interest in that, that sets you apart.
I think just quickly, the tailoring, I love that, because if I don't see tailoring in your 2-page letter of intent, then I just go, okay, this is a standard letter for anyone. And my favorite kind of tailoring would be, this is the position and these are my skill sets. And oh, I've looked at your courses and I can teach, and you use the actual number and the title of the course. And then you can also say within Penn Nursing and then within the University of Pennsylvania, here are centers or here are faculty whose work aligned with mine. And so I can collaborate with them. So please, please, please make sure to use that tailoring. Pepper your 2-page letter with that kind of level of specificity. You've done your homework is what it communicates.
Yeah, I want to echo what Dennis said, particularly if you want to come to a place like where I teach, telling us the courses you could teach, and also talking about how you would fit in the department, whose work, look at our CVs, whose work could you maybe collaborate with, because we do have a strong culture of collaboration in my department. And the tailoring, just like that's the fourth time you've heard someone say it now, right? You need to tailor your letters. It might mean that you apply to fewer places, but you're upping the chance that you're going to get a job.
Thank you, everyone. So for the next question on the list, maybe we could just get a quick kind of thumbs up, thumbs down vote on this next question, which is, would you recommend applying for tenure track positions even if you're not ready to defend this year, just to gain the experience? All right, that's what I thought. Okay, so yes, we're getting a clear no from our panel. Don't do that until you're ready. Okay, good. And then last question has to do with, I think, having a life outside your academic career. So did any of you apply to jobs in locations that you or your partner wouldn't really like to live? Sometimes we hear about how many sacrifices we're expected to make for tenure track positions, like location, salary, starting package, or teaching load. So how would folks react to that question? And Samantha happens to still be visible on my screen, so maybe we'll start with her.
So at the time, I had a partner who is now my husband. We did not have kids at the time. And so we were willing to do a year or two where we were separate, but we also knew that we did not want to live in separate cities. We wanted to be able to be in the same place. We are also spreadsheet people. And we are fortunate in that while he has a PhD, he has had no desire to go into academia. So we have a different kind of two-body problem. So I only applied to jobs where he would be able to find a job. And again, we are also fortunate that he was pretty broad in what he would be willing to do. And so we also, York, if York was not where York was in the country, they hired me very quickly. They posted very early in the search process. They were trying to get someone before some of the other places that might be a little bit more competitive in terms of a prestigious name would have their searches. The selling point for York is that it's pretty close to where I grew up, but it's not in my backyard. And so that did come into play. But I think that it may not seem like it now because you're sitting and you're a grad student or you're a postdoc and you feel really desperate to get that job, get that tenure track job and get set on your way. But as someone who has a little bit of hindsight, it is really nice to live in a place where there's not the stress of not being happy in one's personal life. And so again, I would suggest that you can't be too picky, but you should be a little picky. You don't want to end up somewhere where you're unhappy because then you may just end up needing to do this all over again. And it's really hard to be on the job market. It's really not fun.
I'll quickly echo that and add that my husband and I were gay. So now we only have to look at blue states, unfortunately. And so if a state is fundamentally with a track record of, 30 years of being aggressively anti whatever it is that you are or your politics, please don't make your life miserable. A little caveat, we will entertain some purple states because, they're always on the cusp of being correct or livable. But yeah, what Samantha was saying, go where you can thrive because that's ultimately the most important thing.
I'll offer a different perspective. I was an international student at Duke and, obviously at my undergraduate place. When I was on the job market, and this is true for virtually every international student, you need a tenure track job that year because if you don't get it, if you just get a lectureship, then they're not going to sponsor your work visa. So there is no way then ultimately for you to stay in the US. They might still give you a job. And I'm sure that there are some places that offer work visas, even green cards for lecturers, but those I think are far and few between. So for me, it was just, this is my one shot at I applied to every single job on the market that year. I also applied to jobs outside the US because I just didn't know what was going to happen. And I'll also say that we evolve as people. I am not the person who I was 10 years ago. And I live in South Carolina and I'm happy here. I did not imagine myself saying that when I first moved. This was it was shocking to me in many ways. I live in Greenville. For me, that's the smallest city I've ever lived in. But we just evolve as people also. So I'd encourage folks just to be open to that possibility for your own personal self. Yeah, and just recognizing we all have different limitations. Some of us don't have the privilege of, being on the job market multiple times. You have that one shot.
And for me, I got tricked, Dennis. I got tricked by that red state, blue state thing. I thought that New York as a state was, yeah, a place to be. So my first job at Vassar was in the most racist area. I was stunned. And so then I got a job in Texas as an African-American intellectual in Texas, but it was in the bluest city in the reddest state in the country. Like, I've never lived in a more liberal, people of color are running everything place in Houston, Texas. So I think you just have to have an open mind and don't get caught up into, unless it's your safety, like Dennis was saying. I completely appreciate that. But, I've lived in both extremes, and in Philadelphia, obviously, North Carolina, DC, and Houston was the best city I've ever lived in. So have an open mind. If you're in a discipline like Masha and I are in, philosophy and history, you better apply to every job on the market, because it's not that many of them, and you just have to get a job, because you don't want to have wasted all those years in school to end up being a real estate a realtor because you couldn't get a job in your discipline. Not that being a realtor is a bad thing, but just it's a shame you wasted that time in school and aren't able to use it. So I think apply to everything and just have an open mind, because you can find paradise in rural America, oddly enough, from what people tell me. I've never tried it myself, but that's what I hear.
Wonderful. So there's a question in the chat with our final minute remaining about how should applicants get a good sense of a department's culture and values in order to tailor that letter of intent. Just some quick answers from folks on the call.
Department website. I'll say our department has a search going on right now. We are making sure we have a nice website for it. That's what I used. And if you know people there, that's great. And if you don't, website.
Talk to the graduate students and ask your advisor. Your advisor undoubtedly knows the people in the department. So quickest way to do it.
Yeah, it's always tricky. And I think putting it in the letter of intent to me is a little tricky, because I don't know what that would convey as an insider looking at your application. I mean, it would be great, if you say that you have a great reputation, but again, how you back that up with data, I'm not quite sure. For all you know, it's like Game of Thrones in there, but best of luck. This is always a crapshoot sometimes. You never know until you're there for a few months or a year.
I think it's best to try to assess that in the phone interview or on-campus interview. You can pick up on vibes, I think. And so I would say less concerned with you showing me that you can fit into our culture. That's more of an applicant deciding if they want to live and grow amongst the people in the department.
Wonderful. Thank you all so very much for joining us for the conversation today. Thank you for our audience for the great questions that you shared ahead of time and in the chat today. Please join me in a round of virtual applause for our wonderful panelists. So fantastic to feature all of you and your success stories. And for those of you who are in the audience, join us in 2 weeks from today, when we'll be talking about the on-campus interview and advice for handling that. Thank you, everyone. Take good care.